Before a single shot was fired, the outcome of 1,864 was already decided not on the battlefield, but in the minds of two men. In 202 BC, Scipio Africanus faced Hannibal Barca at the plains of Zama. Most historians focus on the clash of veteran legions against a polyglot Carthaginian army and its 80 war elephants. But the real battle wasn't fought on the field. It was fought here. It was a war between audacious, intuitive aggression and meticulous, predictive analysis. And victory would go to the commander who could master not only his own army, but the mind of his enemy. For 15 years, Hannibal Barca had been a specter haunting the Roman psyche. He was less a general and more a force of nature, an artist of violence who had perfected the craft of psychological warfare. His legendary victories at the Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and especially Cannae were not merely triumphs of maneuver. They were masterpieces of cognitive devastation. Hannibal's operational genius was predicated on a single, powerful insight: that an army's physical center of gravity is its cohesion, but its psychological center of gravity is its commander's will to fight. He targeted the mind first, the body second. His method was consistent: speed, surprise, and a terrifying audacity designed to provoke a predictable emotional response. Impetuous pursuit, panicked formations, and ultimately systemic collapse. He had conditioned the Romans to expect a specific pattern of genius, a signature blend of terror and tactical brilliance. This very pattern, honed over a decade of stunning success, had become his psychological fingerprint. And one man had dedicated his life to studying it. Publius Cornelius Scipio was forged in the fires of Hannibal's making. As a young officer, he had survived the butchery of Cannae, a cataclysm that erased a generation of Roman leadership and seared itself into his consciousness. Where others saw only a monster, Scipio saw a methodology. He began a quiet, obsessive deconstruction of the Carthaginian. His campaigns in Spain became a laboratory. He wasn't just fighting Carthaginians. He was fighting Hannibal's ghost, practicing the very envelopments and deceptions that were his enemy's trademark. Here, we see Scipio engaging in a form of deep cognitive reconnaissance. He was mapping the neural pathways of his rival, identifying the ingrained assumptions and cognitive biases that underpinned Hannibal's decision-making. Scipio's analysis yielded a precise psychological portrait. Hannibal, the predator, relied on initiating contact and controlling the tempo of battle from the first moment. He depended on psychological shock, the terror of a surprise ambush, the sheer weight of his cavalry charge, to disrupt his opponent's command cycle. And most critically, he held a deep-seated conviction in his own intellectual superiority, expecting his Roman adversaries to react with doctrinal rigidity and predictable fury. By invading Africa, Scipio did more than change the theater of war. He flipped the psychological script. For the first time, Hannibal was not the aggressor. He was reacting, summoned home to defend Carthage itself. Scipio, the student, was now setting the stage, baiting the master into a battleground designed not for the Carthaginian army, but for the specific architecture of the Carthaginian mind. The two armies that deployed on the plains of Zama represented two clashing psychologies. On one side, Hannibal, forced into a direct confrontation on open ground, a situation he historically avoided, still relied on his proven instruments of cognitive disruption. His front line bristled with 80 war elephants, not merely as tactical assets, but as a psychological gambit. They were the overture to his symphony of fear, intended to shatter the discipline of the Roman legions before the first swords even met. This was his opening move in the mental chess match, designed to induce panic and dislocate the enemy's command structure. But Scipio had already anticipated this. He wasn't planning to counter the elephants. He was planning to nullify the terror they represented. In a radical departure from Roman military doctrine, Scipio arranged his maniples not in the traditional checkerboard pattern, the quincunx, but in direct, continuous columns. This created open lanes running through his entire formation. When Hannibal's elephants charged, they were not met with an unyielding wall of shields to gore themselves upon, but were channeled harmlessly through the gaps in the Roman line, harassed by skirmishers as they went. Loud horns blared, adding to the sensory chaos and further panicking the beasts, some of which turned back into Hannibal's own lines. Here we see a commander neutralizing not just a weapon, but the psychological effect of that weapon. By refusing to let his army be terrified, Scipio won the first critical engagement, the one for control over the battle's emotional climate. He had rendered Hannibal's primary tool of shock impotent. With his opening gambit foiled, Hannibal fell back on his time-tested masterpiece of infantry tactics, the double envelopment. His first two lines, composed of mercenaries and levies, were designed to bend, to cede ground, to draw the over-eager Roman legions into a carefully prepared killing zone. In the rear, held in reserve, was his untouchable third line, the hardened veterans of his Italian campaign, the very men who had butchered the Romans at Cannae. Hannibal was baiting a cognitive trap, relying on the Romans' well-known psychological bias for aggressive, straightforward assaults. He was counting on Scipio to act like every other Roman consul he had ever faced. Scipio refused. He had drilled his legions relentlessly, instilling in them a level of tactical flexibility that was alien to the Roman way of war. Instead of charging headlong into the sagging Carthaginian center, Scipio's first line, the Hastati, engaged and then methodically fell back through the ranks of the second line, the Principes, who then advanced to continue the fight. This fluid, controlled rotation prevented his army from overextending and becoming disordered. More importantly, Scipio had deployed his entire army in an unusually wide formation, extending his flanks to nearly match the length of Hannibal's line. He was actively denying Hannibal the geometry of encirclement. Each tactical choice was a message sent across the battlefield from one mind to the other. I know what you are going to do, and it will not work. The decisive action, however, came on the wings. Hannibal's victories had always been secured by his superior Numidian and Carthaginian cavalry, which would sweep aside their Roman counterparts and then slam into the rear of the engaged legions. It was the linchpin of his entire system. But at Zama, Scipio held the psychological trump card. Through deft diplomacy, he had won over the loyalty of the great Numidian king, Massinissa. For the first time, a Roman army faced Hannibal with superior cavalry. Scipio unleashed them, and they drove Hannibal's horsemen from the field. And then, in a display of supreme discipline that must have chilled Hannibal to the bone, they did not give chase. They rallied. They waited. And as the infantry lines ground against each other in a bloody stalemate, Scipio's cavalry returned, executing a perfect charge into the rear of Hannibal's elite third line. It was the Cannae tactic. It was Hannibal's own signature move, his most profound contribution to military art, now turned against him with lethal precision. It was the ultimate intellectual theft, a checkmate delivered using the opponent's favorite opening. The predator had become the prey, caught in a trap built from the blueprint of his own genius. The final, brutal phase of the battle was no longer a contest of maneuver, but a testament to a broken psychological script. Hannibal, the grandmaster of battlefield control, was now a spectator to a disaster of his own design, played in reverse. His elite veterans, the core of his army and the symbol of his invincibility, were now trapped, fighting desperately for survival between the disciplined Roman legions to their front and the avenging Numidian cavalry to their rear. Contemporary accounts note Hannibal's stoicism, but behind the mask must have been the profound shock of a genius seeing his own intellectual architecture weaponized against him. Every decision he had made, every tactical preference he had displayed over 15 years, had been anticipated, countered, and ultimately inverted. The defeat at Zama was not merely a tactical loss. It was a complete psychological dismantling. Scipio's victory was not a product of luck, nor was it simply a matter of superior numbers in the critical cavalry arm. It was the result of the most intense and successful case of long-range psychological profiling in ancient warfare. He had studied Hannibal's campaigns not as a history of battles, but as a series of cognitive case studies. He understood Hannibal's reliance on the psychological gambit, his bias toward complex envelopments, and his fundamental assumption of his own intellectual supremacy. Scipio did not defeat the army Hannibal brought to Zama. He defeated the army he knew Hannibal would bring, fielded in the way he knew Hannibal would field it. Here, we arrive at the core lesson of this epic confrontation. Even the most brilliant mind can become a prisoner of its own success. Hannibal's genius, while profound, had become patterned. His repeated victories had grooved certain cognitive pathways into his strategic thinking, making him, in the final analysis, predictable to a rival who was dedicated enough to see the pattern. Scipio's true genius, therefore, was not just in tactical innovation, but in a rare form of cognitive empathy, the capacity to fully inhabit the mind of his opponent, to see the world through his eyes, and to build the perfect trap tailored not for an army, but for a single extraordinary intellect. He found the ghost in Hannibal's machine, and he exercised it with ruthless precision. Scipio's victory required him to abandon centuries of Roman military doctrine and adopt the fluid, flexible tactics of his enemy. This carried immense political and personal risk. As a commander, is it more difficult to overcome the enemy on the field, or to overcome the ingrained cognitive biases and traditions of your own side to achieve victory? Share your strategic assessment in the comments below.